Hey Goblins, Brandon here. If you enjoy what we do and you'd like to help support us create more and maybe even take the podcast to weekly, then the best way right now that you can support us is to head over to patreon.com/goblinsgrowlers. You can find all the different stuff we do there, one-page dungeons, bonus audio for things, all kinds of stuff. So head on over there, and even if it's just $1 or, however much you're comfortable doing, or if you can't put anything toward the Patreon, just tell a friend about it. Tell somebody about the podcast. That's another great way to support us. So, patreon.com/goblinsgrowlers, and we'll see y'all soon.
Hello, adventurers, and welcome to another episode of the Goblins and Growlers podcast. I'm Josh Maltby at BlackCloakDM on Twitter.
I'm Brandon Dingus at Way of Brandalore on Twitter. It looks like you're finally letting GG Peeps die.
I'm not letting GG Peeps die, but there's currently a conversation in the Discord about whether GG Peeps is the best fit, and I decided not to make any assumptions about which way the wind was going to blow that particular needle.
Okay, well that's fair. That's fair. You need to be impartial about the decision.
I have to at least pretend to be impartial, it's just fair.
I like how the leading candidate right now is Glisteners, Goblins and Growlers listeners, which sounds like everybody just left the gym without taking a shower.
I mean, I think about it though, you don't want to sweat, you want to glisten.
How are you doing on this increasingly late Saturday morning?
I'm well, Brandon. How are you?
I'm fine. I've decked myself out in a really obnoxious shirt. With every sartorial decision I make lately, I look like somebody's dad. So I'm just sort of chilling.
I have come to the conclusion that dad style is just when men feel confident enough to dress the way they've always wanted to dress anyway.
I think you're confusing confidence with apathy.
I don't know. I think there's a certain level of you wouldn't have bought that if it was just apathy. You would have just picked up the first thing on the rack on your way into the store.
It was bought for me, so I had very little decision making in the process.
Oh, well, that's its own thing, yeah. I guess. Yeah. All right.
Anyway, we got something special today.
Yeah, let's talk. We've got an indie itch to talk about, and then we've also got an interview that we'll be throwing to ourselves, talking to G. Edward Patterson III, the author of Groats and Grotesques. I'm trying to recall the exact name of his company. I believe it's The Skull as a Complete Gentleman.
While you're recalling that, you can recall the complete name of the book that we talked about, because it's A Groats-worth of Grotesques, and not Groats and Grotesques.
Wait, really? Have I been getting that wrong this entire time?
Yes.
Oh, no.
I've heard you say it before, though. You've got brain plaque or something.
A Groats-worth of Grotesques, which honestly is a better title anyway, let's be real.
Yeah, just keep climbing yourself out of that hole that you dug. We recorded an interview with him earlier this week, and we decided it was just easier to record the interview without framing it within the episode. So we're recording this days later, and then we'll throw to ourselves.
Though I will say, G did seem like he would have been interested in being part of the jibber jabber we do before the main content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll remember that for next time. After his next project comes out, we'll have him back on. To chat about that. Let's get started with scratching that indie itch. And you have selected something that perhaps straddles the line of whether or not we can call it a small indie title.
Well, given the Kickstarter they had recent massive success with, yeah. So those of you who travel in the indie TTRPG spaces probably are already familiar with this title. I was just scrolling through looking for a specific genre of thing and found this and was very excited about it. And then Brandon was like, yeah, I own physical copies of those books. We just haven't talked about them on the podcast yet. The title I speak of is Tuesday Night Games' Mothership. which is a sci-fi horror RPG that involves being in a spaceship and having truly, truly dreadful things happen to your party.
Mm-hmm. I bought the core rulebook, the player survival guide for Mothership, last summer of 2021. It was on sale, and I bought that and then 2 expansion books for it. And they were really nice. They came in like 6x9 format, paperback. Has very much of a zine quality to it. And I said, Josh, we should really talk about these at some point. And then I just never was able to make the time to actually dig deep into it so we could do like an episode on it. So this is a nice meeting in the middle kind of thing to chat about it.
Well, and since Brandon's got the book and now I've got the PDF, if y'all are extremely interested in hearing significantly more about it, then maybe we can do a full episode on it.
Yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So the reason I looked at Mothership in the first place was I was thinking of things Dungeons and Dragons does poorly. And one of those things is horror. It's possible, but it's really difficult. It's just not a system made for that sort of gameplay. So you have to do some tweaking to make it really work.
No, it is not. Every time they try to do horror in Dungeons and Dragons, it always ends up coming out to be some sort of weird mechanic that you have to give extra brain power to remembering. I mean, the solution there is write better stories, be a better storyteller. But some people need a framework within which to work to accomplish that.
Yeah. And I think having a system that is built for precisely these kinds of stories helps with that a lot. I find that a lot of the stuff I've played in D&D that involves space tends to be a little bit lackluster itself. It's just hard to mesh elves in the forest and spaceships. I am looking at you, Expedition of the Barrier Peaks. You did well in your time. I think your adventure you wrote, Brandon, is probably the closest I've seen get to really good on that, where you have an alien-style space wolf tracking down the party as they explore this large, abandoned dwarven mining outpost.
I appreciate your confidence on that.
It's a tough genre to hit well, and I think this game does both of those things exceedingly well. I will say the one thing I kept running into as I was scrolling through was I was like, God, there's so much math and so many dice.
Yeah.
And then so much math on those dice.
Increasingly, my predilections for gaming have tended toward fewer dice, fewer rules, and more storytelling focus. So Mothership is 100% in the opposite direction from where I like to trend these days. But that doesn't mean I don't like it. I would just have to be very intentional about sitting down to play it. It is 100% not a pick up and play kind of thing. You can't have like 5 people over on Friday night and then all of a sudden be like, hey, does anybody want to play Mothership? I'll teach you how to play it.
Well, I think part of the reason why they have so many dice and so much math is because they want to have something that is a really immersive experience and involves a lot of individual components coming together to create something really terrifying. It's not oftentimes when we start talking about things having too many dice and having too many specifics for their rules, you and I tend to be talking about war games where it's
or Star Wars.
Yes, Star Wars has a lot of dice. I will concur. This to me does not have a lot of that war games kind of vibe. Like, there's a lot of detail in here and there's a lot of info, but I think it's more of that kind of sci-fi, like, you gotta know about the hyperspace drive in order to know that if you reverse the capacitors, the whole thing's gonna go overload and destroy the entire ship. Like, it's less an issue of, oh, well, you're 15 feet away and the cone only handles 10 feet of distance. Like, it's less of that and more of really trying to get you into the space of the game itself. I think if I took the time to really, really learn these rules, I think I'd have a ton of fun playing this game. I know you've got physical copies, so maybe we should make some plans to sit down, really figure out how it's played, and get, if not a campaign going, then at least a couple of one-shots.
Yeah. The sale that I took advantage of last year, I was able to choose 3 books. So I got the survival guide, and then I got 2 campaign expansions, or at least I'm going to say campaign expansions because that's the nomenclature with which we're familiar. But one of them is Pound of Flesh, and it involves having to go to Prospero's Dream, which is a space station. And it, on like the 3rd page of it, it says, hey, there's no canon for what happens in here. It's more of like sort of a sandbox situation where you can decide what your players want to do and what the goal can be and everything like that. So I think that's cool about this one. It's very, the physical book at least, it's, like I said, very zine-y. It's not like glossy cover or anything like that. It's saddle stitched, 6x9 format. It feels very, very well put together. The quality on the layout and the editing is very top notch on this. And then the other one I got was Gradient Descent, which before we started recording, I told Josh it has very much an Evangelion feel with some of its typography, which I liked. And the maps in it, like the room maps, because this one involves having to go to it is a production facility for synthetic life forms, and like the AI has taken over. So it's sort of a mix of like season 1 of Star Trek Picard, Chrono Trigger, where you have to go to the future and fight all the robots to help Robo out. And some of the interior maps are done like circuit diagrams, which I thought was a really cool touch. To give it that flavor, but it also has a lot of haunting spookums imagery in it.
I do enjoy some good haunting spookums imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So Brandon was like, we should make sure that we highlight, we were aware of this before, and a lot of people are, in part because their Kickstarter was recently funded for $1.7 million. So a fair few people are aware of this game, but for those of you who aren't and are looking for something that's a little bit more sci-fi, a little bit more horror, I think it's well worth highlighting, especially since the Kickstarter, being completely funded, is still doing pre-orders for their box set.
Yeah, which... the Kickstarter was for the first edition box set for Mothership. And like Josh said, the pre-orders are still open. It looks like they're going to be closing down pre-orders in November of this year, and then they're planning to ship in December. So you can get the deluxe set for $99, which for a complete set of all of this with the core rules, a bunch of the different adventures or campaigns, including the two of the ones that we talked about, plus a poster-sized map, a trifold DM screen. That's super worth it. And they have tier, like another tier that's like a mega bundle that comes with a t-shirt and some other stuff. So you can sort of spend as much as you want on that. There's also like a core set, which is only $60, that has not as many expansions, but still everything that you need to get rolling with it. It's Mothership is one of those things. It's definitely an indie type production, but it's just such high quality work. You should absolutely support it if you like outer space style games, if you like survival horror games, if you like either of those, I think you should give this a try because it marries them really well.
Yeah, it's got a lot of really cool mechanics. It's got a panic mechanic, which rhymes, so it's good.
Panic Mechanic is going to be my post-punk band.
And so the consequences for failing saves sometimes are beyond just, oh, you don't do the thing or something bad happens to you. Sometimes it involves actually putting mental duress on your character, which is always fun. I'm looking at you, Call of Cthulhu. So yeah, if you're in the market for space horror, I think you'd be hard pressed to find something that's going to be a better fit for that need.
I just here's our Soviet arcade museum for this episode. I googled panic mechanic because I thought that's too good for somebody not to have already used that. And it is a movie from 1996. And it says, after Hanky Pranky, star of a candid camera TV show, loses his job to affirmative action, he applies for a job at a stress academy. And it's not long before he discovers his boss is morally crooked, but it's too late. His employment contract has been signed and sealed. So this sounds like a terrible film right off the bat. It appears to be a South African movie, and I know none of the people who are in it. So there you go. Rant / digression over.
If Brandon and I need to watch Panic Mechanic and then comment on it, just let us know.
That would
at Goblins Growlers on Twitter.
Unless a lot of money shows up in our PayPal, that is not happening. This just sounds awful. What's the Rotten Tomatoes score on this? Let's see. It is 57% audience score, and it has 0 reviews on the tomato meter. So I'm going to say this probably is not worth our time.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah. But anyways, do you have any other thoughts on Mothership?
A quick forewarning for folks who are completely unfamiliar with it. It does handle a little bit of like graphic content. It does also have adult themes and language in it. So I wouldn't say that it's really what's the word I'm looking for? Really crass.
Yeah. It probably has some body horror in it too.
Yes, it absolutely does. I wouldn't say it's crass. I would say it's all well within theme. But if you're the kind of person who is more into thrillers than into full-on horror, then this might be a little too much for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But, do your research. Check it out. How much is it on itch, Josh, just to get the player survival guide?
Believe it or not, it is pay what you want with a suggested price of $5.
That's a bargain.
It is a huge bargain.
And that's the strategy, though, right? You sell people the gateway drug of the player survival guide for $5, and then you make your money with the expansions and things like that. It's a good strategy.
We're looking at you, 5e SRD.
But yeah, check it out. I promise that at some point I will run this game. Maybe later this year, at least for a session or two, and see how it goes.
I guarantee we could get Gabe involved in that.
He would love it. Well, you know what? Why don't we just give Gabe these books and he can run it?
We'll get Gabe to run it for us. Yes.
Yeah. Outsource everything. All right. Are we ready to transition over to the interview?
Yes, I believe we are going to go now live to the studio where Brandon and Josh are interviewing G. Edward Patterson III as we speak. Over to you, Josh.
Oh, no, wait. Before we throw to us, I just want to point out that we ran into some audio issues while we were recording this because...
yes.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to cause like any problems for anybody, but I just want to lampshade it so nobody thinks that we didn't realize it.
I counter that. It will absolutely cause issues for our audio editor. He is dealing with a single stereo track to edit all 3 of us on, and that is a nightmare.
Yeah, this is because G had issues with his audio and his microphone shutting off, and we didn't realize until too late that when his microphone shut off the first time, it killed the multi-track Zencaster recording that we were doing. And we were too deep in to restart at that point. So we made an executive decision in the moment. So
audio might be a little funky. The cuts might be a little funky. Bear with us and have patience for dear sweet Scott Moore.
Yeah. So it'll be fine, and we'll probably repeat this for the next episode too, because we ended up talking for what was it, almost like an hour and 45 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, it was something in that vein.
Yeah, so we're gonna have to break it into 2. It has a lot of rabbit trails. It might be in part 2 where we end up talking about offset printing methods for a while. But I promise you that we're talking about tabletop role-playing game for the great majority of it.
Okay, can I turn it over to me now?
Yeah, you can turn it over to you.
Okay, over to me in the studio. Thanks, me. We now go live to the studio with our guest, George Edward Patterson III. Thank you for joining us, George.
G. Edward.
You said call you George.
Yeah, I know. You can call me.
Okay.
But my full name is G. Edward Patterson.
G. Edward Patterson III, colloquially known as George.
Yeah. That's
okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is really cool.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So for those who don't remember, or if Josh forgot to mention it before he threw to this segment, George is the author of Groats-worth of Grotesques that we talked about some months ago. The really cool Baroque bestiary that I found, and he somehow found out about us and messaged us and was kind enough to show up to chat about his work with us.
There's a teeny bit of a story there, but not
okay.
Much.
I would love to hear it.
Yeah. I think this may relate to future things. But I was experiencing writer's block, and so I self-Googled. So, I block an hour. This is my new thing. I set a phone alarm. It's like 1 hour, you got to write. And it's like, go. And then if, and that tends to work, but sometimes it doesn't. And so I was just like, I don't know. Has anyone read my last book lately? Because that gives you like a little bit of a charge to go on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just typed it in, and then your podcast came up. And it was helpful. So, I'm a longtime fan of the show.
You're one of our many Samsung podcast applicants.
Pre-Samsung. I knew you guys before Samsung. So
okay. Yeah, you're an OG on the whole thing.
You got in when you were still underground.
At least.
Yeah. But so I'm excited to hear about other stuff that you're working on. I know before we started recording, you said you had something that you might want to plug / talk about. But I would love it if you could just start off telling us the story about a Groats-worth of Grotesques and, describe it sort of in your own words. We've talked about it, but what brought you to it? What gave you that idea?
Like most people who have been dungeon mastering for a while, I have like a big file of my role-playing game that I've never finished. Mm-hmm. That literally is 20 years in the works. So then the pandemic hit, and so I was like, oh, I should, it's time to publish this. But I knew that was unwise. So I was like, I should publish a part of this. Especially because after 20 years, it's enormous, right? Mm-hmm. So I was like, I'll just do a bestiary, because that was what was striking my, I broke it down into different sections, and I was like, all right, I'm most interested in monsters now. So focused on monsters, and had that extra. Well, and then the irony is my job actually got more busy during the pandemic. But I did get in that pandemic mindset where I just started working my butt off to deal with pandemic stuff.
Yeah.
And hammered out a bestiary.
No, it's great. I think I can't remember exactly, but I think I was looking around for just unique like bestiary type content, and I was trying to focus on like system neutral stuff when I found it. And I really appreciated that it was system neutral and sort of how you broke down like the monster block stats essentially to be able to port them over from something to one thing. And it felt very much, and I said this at the time, like an old Alexander von Humboldt scientific treatise as I was reading through them. Did you get any kind of inspiration or anything from like old, like Victorian type scientific literature?
Yeah, definitely in the language, that period is really important, because I was working with a lot of stuff in translation, and I was working mostly in the public domain. Mm-hmm. So that's really where I think that's where you keyed into that. I have, since you did that podcast, episode on my book, I did buy an Alexander von Humboldt book. I have not read it yet. I was like, oh yeah, that's totally who I'm inspired by. I should probably buy that. But that aside, it's a lot of, kind of the point of the book was to work with a lot of this public domain stuff. Because I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I wanted to make it mythic and have a lot of resonances and have things that people have, read or seen before, just, peppered in there just a little bit. And I feel like that makes it, stronger and, more creepy. I think that really helps with the horror. Part of it is that, a lot of the things, they sound wrong, just slightly off. It's that kind of uncanny that I want to work in that realm of like uncanniness. So those works of translation, so it'd be like Latin work. So it's actually a lot of Pliny, Isidore of Seville, Edward Topsell, just these like classic bestiaries or encyclopedias. But there are these public domain translations. So they have that 19th century feel. So it's sort of like, that's the layer. It's like, original text, 19th century. And then and then there's lots of little subtle winks in there. Not too many.
What's your favorite monster out of this? Because I think Josh and I did our top 5 from each of them.
Yeah. God, that's such an obvious question. And I should have prepared for that. Just earlier today, someone asked me what my favorite artist, they were like, oh, let me throw you a little, softball here. What's your favorite artist? They were showing off how great Dali was. And I was like, I have no fucking clue. That's my first F word. What I really loved about the book was I had it in this like taxonomy at first. And I had everything, I divided it into like, beasts and celestial beings and so on. And then I had this revelation that I should just do it alphabetical, just like an original bestiary. And, or, the monster manuals, alphabetical. And what that meant is ant went first. And I was just like, oh, well, what the heck's gonna, people are gonna get this book and they're gonna open up the drive-through preview and it's a bestiary and then they go to ant. So I'm gonna just mention the ant because I sat there for so long being like, how the hell do you make an ant really work in a fantasy situation? And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, ants. So the illustration is really fun because it's from the Ant and the Grasshopper. So it's like a 17th century book illustration about the ant and the grasshopper. And I'm thinking about ants, and ants are they're sort of the hobgoblin of the insect kingdom. They're organized, but they're warlike, right? So I armed the grasshopper with the spear. And I had the ants it was just like, so it was the ants talking to the grasshopper being like, oh, you gotta prepare for the winter. So I switched it to the ants talking to the grasshopper being like, you gotta you gotta mess these people up. Like, we're going to give you this spear. We made this spear and you're going to, you got to stab the foot of this adventurer. Right. And so then I was like, oh, these are great. Like, who wouldn't want ants as an ally? They can, like, they're completely invisible. They go through cracks. They can go anywhere. So, how do they, and then I found another ant illustration and I put a little diamond in its mouth. And then, they can crawl in there and get that diamond for you.
I like, to your point of like, oh man, how can I start this off with this? I like how you even have like a marginalia on that page that says, what a tiny monster to begin a bestiary with. I gather you're wondering how this book is going to turn out.
Oh yeah, totally. I did that and I was like, so yeah, I added that like author voice column.
I love those. I love those.
It's a little confusing because it's author voice mixed with like, for some of the monsters, it's sort of like, well, there's actual mechanical stuff that I stuck there, but it was just too futzy to stick in with any of the other sections. Like I wanted to keep, I wanted to clean up well, as you know, that's, you know, it starts off, there's an illustration, there's a quote, and the quote's there to just have you know, like an NPC say that quote, or like a song from that, and then it goes to a description, and that's in world, and that's supposed to be like, as a, you know, game master, you've discovered this book and it's about these monsters but it's from the actual world. And then the side column is me being like, all right, this is what you do with it.
I like what you did with this, for as much as like a hurdle that starting it off with an ant could be, like you were talking about. It's really good. Like, I like, you know, the little bit of world building that you're even able to shove in there. Like, yeah, you know, they live in miniature underground cities. They have small markets, homes, fortresses. You're like alluding to a culture that they've got, and you bring in like poisonous ants to do some, so they can have some kind of offensive abilities toward humans and things like that. I wonder why you didn't just like start, when you were thinking like, oh man, how do I start this with an ant? Why you didn't just like skip it and start with the Antichthons?
Yeah, no, I really, as soon as it happened, I was like, no, that's a great way. I mean, who, you know, it's like the smallest, start with the smallest, tiniest, dinkiest thing, and then everyone immediately is like, you know, what's wrong, what's going on wrong here? Right. I mean, I think they already, the introduction is so weird. And you know, oh, speaking of your last podcast, when you were talking about the you know, what is a role-playing game? You know, I love, it's like my favorite thing about all role-playing books, you know, going back to the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, is the like ponderous introductions. You know, like a preface, introduction, a word from the author. And then there's the book, and then there's like appendices, like just a million appendices. I love that sandwich. I'm trying to get the screen here. It's mirror image. It's hard. I love that sandwich. So yeah, so I start with that introduction, which is, you know, in a character. That's supposed to be where the author's speaking, but it's in a character voice, and it's you know, it's difficult. And then I go through a whole rant about I don't know if you caught that, where there's like certain monsters that definitely don't exist because they're ridiculous. And then all the other monsters are, you know, even more ridiculous. Like, why is a two-headed snake impossible? But that's in this source material. Like that, I got a lot of that from Pliny, who's an amazing source, where it's, you know, he writes this encyclopedia, and you hear his voice, you know, like there was no a concept of like a scientific voice, right? So he's just writing it. He's like, all right, this is what's going on with this country. This is what's going on with that country. And he's like, that people told me that it's total BS. And then he'll be like, well, here's the thing that's true about dragons. And then you're like, well,
also Pliny the Elder was the one responsible, like pretty much the source of all the Atlantis myths, basically, because he was like, hey, so there's this big island off the coast outside the Pillars of Hercules. You might want to look into that. And then, you know, thousands of years later, people are still like, yeah, man, with their tinfoil hats on, like, yeah, it got sunk. We lost you.
The audio finally gave out.
Apparently, we're not allowed to talk about Plato, so let's move on.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I really appreciated starting with the ant, because then whoever's coming in here that's like, I thought we were gonna get into some really extravagant, really like extraordinary creatures. If they scroll past the ant at all, they immediately are into, I heard Brandon pronounce it Antichthons. I've only seen it read. I've never like heard it said. I would have thought it was Antichthonies, but I don't actually know.
I've heard it pronounced both ways.
Perfect.
I called it what I called it because of the way I've heard people pronounce the Antikythera mechanism.
I think of it as the chthon. You know, you just think of chthon, chthonic, and it's anti, so it's the antichthonic. But yeah, I have heard people pronounce it the other way.
I think I went the direction. Right. I think I went the direction I did because of Antipodes.
Oh.
I have no idea.
There's So I'm also into. I have like a lot of people who do role playing stuff. I have a lot of hobbies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So another hobby I have is like horticulture, and you use a lot of Latin names in horticulture. And the consensus there is no one actually knows how to pronounce Latin. So you just do your best, and then that's fine.
Yeah. We have best guesses, and we'll just roll with
and
those.
They're all valid because no one actually knows.
And I want to make sure to set the record straight on you being smarter than me, because I think when your mic went out, you were correcting me that it was Plato that started the Atlantis myth, but Pliny actually just tagged onto it like a bandwagoner.
Did you just Google that?
I Googled it to double check it, and because I remember I read Pliny the Elder's like one of the encyclopedias like 10 years ago. I started reading through it, and I remembered references to it, and then I just completely forgot about Plato. So sorry. Sorry, Aristotle. I forgot about your boy.
There you go.
I just realized something.
What's that?
The current recording in Zencastr stopped when we lost audio on the microphone.
I think we can just pull audio from this at this point.
We're just gonna have to live with it.
It'll be fine.
It'll be fine.
Yeah,
it'll be fine. Well, we can redo this. We can recreate these moments.
Yeah, yeah.
Just have a Google transcribe it, and then we'll just read it.
Nothing
like a teleprompter. It'll be great.
It'll come out really natural.
Yeah.
You're lying, Josh. You're lying.
Everything is always natural all the time. That's our world.
What the hell are we even talking about?
We were talking about moving from ants into we'll say Antichthons for now.
Yeah. They're great. They're the Romulans, by the way. I don't know.
Oh,
okay. Okay.
So, and that's all in the sidebar. I don't know if you there's a lot of really fun rules where they always wear masks.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was in part there's a thing with this bestiary where it's all seeded from the source material, and sometimes the source material is the art, and sometimes it's the encyclopedias, right?
Right.
So I had a thing where I think it started with Pliny with the Antichthons, and then it's like they're basically like the people you don't understand, the incomprehensible people on the other side of the planet, and there's just these great illustrations of people in costumes for festivals.
Mm-hmm.
So, like medieval, Renaissance, early modern festivals had just, they spent a lot of time on those costumes. And there's a lot of illustrations about them, and they all look amazing. And so I was like, well, this, I have to create a monster to fit these costumes.
Okay.
And so the idea is that they're all in masks, which is it's a great villains in masks. That's a classic thing. And they're weird and they're incomprehensible because they're wearing these costumes that are intentionally meant to be weird and incomprehensible. But then I was like, I want them to be the Romulans. I want them like everything that's going wrong in your world. It's a Romulan trap, right? So then the idea is that the mechanics are if you actually remove the mask, there's a random chance that the person.
Oh, okay.
This is really stepping on the DM's toes here.
Yeah. It's like a cross between Romulans and the Court of Owls from Batman, kind of, where that like the secret society full of the wealthy and powerful.
Oh
yeah.
Oh,
Are you a big Star Trek fan?
Star Trek? Yeah, I make some Star Trek references. Sure.
Okay. I was just curious. I recently rewatched Balance of Terror, which was the first time we saw the Romulans. So that's just why I was curious.
I'm trying to get my 10-year-old into old Star Trek. It's hard.
It really is. I had to become an adult before I got into old Star Trek. I was very much raised on Next Generation.
It's all building up to like being like, you have to see Star Trek 2 because it's the greatest movie of all time.
Absolutely.
And so it's like I forced him to watch the first Khan episode.
Okay, I mean that's really all you need.
That's all. It is all you need. But like it's a 10-year-old is just like, what the crap is this? Plus, all the ones you stream now are really weird because they have CGI effects. I don't know if you've watched them.
Yeah. I have a Paramount Plus subscription, and I've gone back and watched some of the. I'm a huge Star Trek nerd.
All right. Yeah. Well, I'll never Plus.
Yeah. So the point is, I actually love the enhanced special effects, but that's not.
I think they're fun. Yeah. I think they did it. They did a pretty good job. I'm gonna agree. They did a pretty good job.
Okay. But anyways, better than the Romulans, the Anticathons.
Yeah. So you remove their mask, and there's a chance that it's like someone you know, and a chance that it's like an important NPC. So it's like, it's like one in 10 it's someone you know, 1 in 100 it's like an NPC that you've known forever.
That's really cool.
So
you've got it marked here that it could even be the character themselves, which I love as a little bit of arcane horror.
Yeah.
Yeah. That also feels very Star Trek.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Like clones or something like that.
Yeah. Or it's like, no, you were the clone the whole time. Well, no, that's like.
I like this one. No air wagon has ever been seen by human eyes, and preferably they remain unseen and mysterious to the characters. However, the game master can choose to incorporate them. The author imagines them as flag machines along the designs of Da Vinci or de Bergerac. I thought that was... I just love the little marginalia notes throughout there. Just completely random stuff.
Oh, yeah. That specifically was me being like, showing these airships will ruin it.
Mm-hmm.
So just don't. But then I'm like, oh, if you want to do it.
Here's how I want you to do it if you have to.
If you have to. Yeah, I just want them to be totally... That's the idea. They have to be totally mysterious, and they totally violate... Well, this is part of the thing with monsters in general, right? Mm-hmm. So monsters in general, to be effective, need to violate rules. And that's sort of like one of the central theses with the whole book is that monster books, like say the original Monster Manual, what I think we're moving to is less like, okay, here's a monster, let's stat it up. So it's something you can kill. Like, here's my little figure, and then here's this little monster figure, and then they fight, and then this has hit points and then it dies. So like, we're in the modern, 21st century era, and then now it's like, okay, monsters have to be monster stories, every monster. And so role-playing rules have to be broken for a monster to function. So they have to, like, that's why I wanted to, like, step on the DM toes. It's just be like, oh, sorry, I screwed up your game. But it's a monster. It's like, it's got to screw up your game. Otherwise, like, if your game doesn't get screwed up, then you're not fighting a monster.
Yeah. And I've talked about this before. It's sort of the way I run combat encounters is several years ago, I just kind of started to hate how combat encounters run, like too video gamey, essentially, even in 5th edition. So I started just sort of disregarding hit points and things like that. And I do it more as like a dice-based storytelling thing. Like I let the players get their hits in. I take the temperature of the table, see how it's going, and then sort of adjust the strength or health of the monster depending on the momentum of the moment, really. And I think that's maybe a little bit of what you're talking about. I think we might be talking about the same thing, but coming at it from opposite directions in terms of like me as a DM breaking the monster rules to try to have a better experience for the players. And you're talking about using sort of the mechanics of the game as a framework to break, to make a more interesting experience for the players, perhaps at the expense of the DM.
Yeah. Well, what you're doing is you're violating the rules of the designer, and then I'm coming in as the designer violating the rules of the DM. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's a really cool way to look at it. So I do want to touch base on some of these other monsters, but I would like to get sort of a much bigger picture of things before we dig back into those. And, you talked about stuff you've been working on for like 20 years. If you could maybe give us sort of the capsulized review of your career as a content creator in the gaming space, and just tell us how you got started, some of the stuff you've done, some of the stuff that you're proud of, some of the stuff that you're not proud of, that kind of thing.
Well, this is where, all right. Oh, here's a good story. I starting in like the 90s, late 90s, I had that kind of thing where I played just an insane amount of role-playing games, elementary school, middle school, and then I discovered girls, and then it dropped. And then I went to college, and I went to college with people who, in retrospect, all my friends in college they're all huge gamers now. But we never gamed. And then I graduated, and then I was like, I'm going to run a like first edition D&D game. At the time, second edition had just come out, and I'm just like, I'm not even going to acknowledge second edition. I'm going first edition. Like, I just want to go pure, childhood D&D. And then at that point, I just started, creating, like working on my like Mac clone. I had a Umax 900. And I, started typing it out on some free word editor, and literally the text from that exists inside this bestiary. So, 97, 98. So some of this stuff is like 25. Like,
wow, that's really cool.
It's 25 years old of text. All I tried to do at one moment, I did one submission to Dungeon Magazine. And at the time, so this would be like 98. I had this like ponderous alchemist adventure, where I just was like, they're doing alchemy all wrong. I'm reading Paracelsus and alchemy is like this. And I wanted to create an adventure around it. And it was probably the most boring thing, but whoever was editing, I wish I still had it. They just wrote me a really long letter back being like, this is the most boring thing.
Oh,
like you, like this notoriously terrible publication will not even come close to publishing your adventure.
That's the kind of rejection letter you frame.
Yeah, exactly. I really should have, but that's a 25-year-old letter at this point.
Yeah. And you say that was like in the late 90s, around like
late 90s.
98.
And then I just, I've just been plugging away in the background, running little campaigns here and there for people. And but that, when I started early on this and started early on like, oh, Google Docs, this is great. I can make contributions anywhere. And it just grew and grew and grew. And it's, hundreds of thousands of words. So then, so really I just started with the pandemic. So really I'm fresh at this, and I decided to come in like swinging. So I'm like, I'm not going to like do this zine thing. I'm going to come in with a 250 page illustrated book, because if this is the last thing I do, it's like something, right? Like, that's, if you write
big dungeon master energy you're thrown out there.
Yeah, exactly. It's totally this like, channeling this like Gygaxian, effusive amount of writing, all I picture with Gary Gygax is just someone sitting there at a typewriter, like all night long. He comes home from his insurance job and he ignores he hated his wife. And he's like, he's typing this, and it's just like, pages and pages, and just, throwing them behind him. And I wanted to capture that, like, just be like, I wanted the book to come off like this person. Like, I want people to be like, is this person insane?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely comes off, at least to me, Josh, I won't speak for you, but it definitely comes off to me as like somebody who had about 1,000 ideas, and they fit only the smallest fraction of them into this book. It just feels so fully formed the way it came out. And I guess that makes sense, since you said it was part of like a larger project that you've been working on for like 20 years. It has that very lived in
25 years.
25 years. I'm sorry. That's how long I've been playing D&D. 25 years.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that like, I've never not been playing D&D.
Mm-hmm.
So my brother got the Holmes when I started writing. So I have like 1978 character sheet, which is like like in crayon, like, and me just inventing. Like, he had one of those he got one of those box sets where like they ran out of dice and it was just the chits. So
I've heard of those, but I've never seen one. That's really cool.
And then so like I've never not. So I have like no moment where I learned to play D&D. It's just like it just formed with my memories.
And you learned to play on first edition.
Well, yeah, we played, I think, I think most people play this way, is like, what we would do is we would take, the Holmes, and we would take the Moldvay, and we would take like Greyhawk, and we would take first edition, and whatever was the most powerful was the rules. So it'd just be like, I have this gem from Greyhawk and it does 1d 100 damage.
And that's legal now because it's powerful.
Whatever is the most powerful is the most legal.
Yeah. I've played like a first edition clone before, and it was one of the most horrifying gaming experiences I ever had because it was so lethal. I just was not used to it.
Yeah, I have a very distinct memory of dying in the Tomb of Horrors and bawling, just uncontrollably crying. And my brother called up his friend, and his friend used a wish to resurrect me.
Aw.
And that was very sweet because, because this is like... And he called multiple friends because he had to find someone who was home.
Amazing.
Hit them up on their beeper if you can't get them at the house.
This is so before beepers.
I was born in 81, so I don't know a world before beepers. My dad was on call all the time, so we constantly had those things floating around the house. But tell me a little bit more about the sort of larger 25-year project that you pulled a lot of this from. Is it basically just like your campaign world, essentially?
Yeah, it's essentially that, but at some point I'm packaging it for release. So it has sort of like it's all under this concept. It's the enormous vagueness is its sort of general rule.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like a sort of that's like a Chinese mythological term. I really focus on this sort of Baroque period,
mm-hmm.
which is in, so the Groats-worth of Grotesques is meant to eventually, the monster. Oh, but like the Monster Manual is the first release for first edition AD&D, right?
Mm-hmm.
So eventually maybe I'll release those rules, but it's what you were saying about it being a very careful world that's what's in there, is that it's a cultivated world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this sort of late modern, it has this sort of central conceit where it's like Galileo gets his telescope and he looks up into the stars, and instead of seeing what he saw, he sees Ptolemy's crystal spheres. So it's this like it's this early modern period, but it turns out that Pliny was right. So it's these early modern people being like, oh shit, like, oh, well, that's just number 2. I'm not doing that bad.
It's fine. You're fine. We'll put a content warning at the beginning of it.
Like, oh yeah, this is totally real. That's like a really important thing it's just the tiniest thing, but in Groats-worth of Grotesques, the swallows in the winter fly to the moon. And that's because there's no such thing as this modern world. There's no atmosphere like that. There's no vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
The swallows are just like, all right, it's time to go to the moon. And that's where they migrate. Because that's just through the ether, right? And they can do that.
I mean, it makes as much sense as anything else during that time period. Like, why not?
Totally, yeah. And that's it's something I return to again and again. Is people will, with fantasy world building, I think it's like a fundamental mistake. I belong to this Facebook group, a fantasy world building and map making Facebook group, and there's so much deliberation over plate tectonics. And I'm just like, plate tectonics are from like the 60s. Like, it has absolutely nothing to do with fantasy. Like, are
they talking about like continental drift in their fantasy worlds? Or
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm just like, there's like a wealth of like really interesting old texts about like, what did people think the Earth was like? What is the Earth? How does geology work is something that people were trying to figure out for years. And all of their explanations are so great and so fantasy and support things like an infinite underworld.
I will say I've never seen this Facebook group that you're a part of. And in my experience, anybody who starts getting really, really into map making starts asking questions like, what does their Pangea look like, though? And it's like, stop it. You're getting too deep. You need to back it up.
Yeah, they're like so concerned about where water goes.
Yeah.
And there's these like, the map making groups are great. Well, I mean, it's we're tabletop role playing people are neurodiverse, and so we have to accept everyone's little quirks. But it cracks me up because it's just like, to me, it's just not it's like, oh, this is an opportunity to do fantasy world building. And you're missing it. You're like, that's just modernism. Like, just that's the whole point of fantasy, is get rid of modernism and then see what happens. Like, you're throwing all the rules out. Like, how does the universe work? It works literally any way you want it to, and that's the point of doing it.
Yeah, and you've sort of met it halfway there, because but like you said, yours is sort of set sort of in an early modernish kind of period, but you've thrown out all the rules of modernity, essentially, and just let everything continue to run wild.
Yeah, and then that's what you explore. And what's great is pre-modern, like, contradictions are fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your science is just as good as mine.
Yeah, or like, oh, that's right, and it's like, oh, it's wrong, but they're actually both true, because we can't figure this out. And then that's great for a campaign, because you can just you can throw something out, and people will be like, well, how'd you throw that out? And you're like, well, what do you mean? Like, what is reality? Like, the gods can just change it. There's gods are real.
Yeah,
they can just change everything, so they don't care about you. Maybe you pissed off the gods. You shouldn't have done that.
Speaking of gods, I see that you also threw in the behemoth to of Old Testament fame into Groats-worth. Yeah, and I think Leviathan's in there as well.
Yeah, behemoth and Leviathan are in there, and they're enemies. Yeah,
right. But yeah, so was that wouldn't have been in Pliny, would it have been?
No, I don't think so. That behemoth really came off. I love that illustration. Put that edit that in. Is the
talking about the guy getting run through with like the narwhal tusk?
Oh yeah, that is literally a narwhal tusk.
Yeah.
That's that's like a so that's a scene where it's like a biblical, there's lots of great illustrations of biblical plagues, right? And everyone's always like, oh, the biblical plague is coming. And there's a variety of, like the locusts. When I have my locust entry, I have one of those. And so then I just like grabbed a narwhal horn and just shoved it through one person.
And that's the idea. Gandalf or something.
Yeah, and that's the idea. Is it's like this is that's supposed to feel Old Testament. Like you it punches out of the earth, and it just ruins stuff. So that's a great example of like I really don't like fantasy games that scale well. I feel like fantasy games should scale poorly. And so like this, like the False Land, that's another one. The False Land is another Leviathan type myth. It's just like, it's a monster, but like, you don't fight it.
Yeah.
Like there's no way to win against it. It just kills you.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
You have to
think that so many of your monster battles in any given setting are going to end that way. Like saying like, well, I'm 15th level, like means nothing to some giant dragon.
Yeah, I gave him like, I almost like, unfortunately was like, I don't know, I'll give him like hit die 20. That was like my solution. It was like, I don't know. Does anyone scale above that? I mean, I imagine people do, but
I will say I've always been a little bit annoyed by the fact that in Dungeons and Dragons, not only are Tarrasques something you can just fight, but by the time you're like level 18, level 20, it's like, this is a very doable fight for an average party. Like, it's not even like, oh, we're probably going to still die, even though we are max level characters with all the right gear. But we got to do it because that's how our party's going to go out with a bang.
Right. And with like a sword.
Right. Like, you can't. Why?
What does the sword do? Like it's like his skin is as thick as a sword, right?
Yeah,
so you're just like, what is that? Oh, but it's like this sword does this like crazy bonus damage, and like I'm expending, like you're expending everything. So that's just a fundamental problem with that is you get up to those levels, and then if you just expend all of your resources, what can you do? You can do anything. And then you're just like, well, why does the Tarrasque have, what did it start with? Like I think it had 300 hit points in Monster Manual 2 or something.
Mm-hmm. That sounds right.
That's not that many hit points.
No, it's really not. It's really not. Because, God, I think I've at like 10th level, I've had people fighting dragons or something like that had like 200 and some odd hit points.
Yeah, that's why. Oh, by the way, that's why I scaled dragons down.
Yeah,
dragons are little.
Yeah. Have you run like these monster stat blocks in any existing systems to see how they, I'm not going to say balance because they're not really meant to balance, but just like how well they function.
Yeah, I mean, most of them. I'm currently with adults now. I run Black Hack, which works. I mean, especially it works pretty well with that. That's also why it's like HD 20 is infinity in Black Hack because that's minus 20.
Right.
So it's just like, okay, you only hit on a critical hit in that.
Okay.
That's that's that. No, I haven't run most of them. I've run half of them tops.
But the half you have run, you're happy with how they turned out.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's easy. I mean, of course, it's easy for the designer because it's like that's basically my DM style, right?
Yeah.
So it's like it's hard to relate. Everyone has their own. Oh, this will loop back to what you're trying to say about designers and DMs and stuff. Every DM who's DM for a while knows how to do their thing, right? I can, you're like, okay, I can do it on my table. It's not always amazing. It doesn't always work for everyone, but it's like a thing I can do.
Yeah.
So all these monsters are a thing I could do. The challenge was to translate whatever I do intuitively into some vague universal format.
That's a challenge Josh and I have run into before because we, like pre-pandemic at least, we ran like weekly public game sessions at breweries where we would write original content. We would go and we would just do D&D pickup games, running it for people. It became like a big thing at the time. And we realized that it was very complicated to take the way we run tables and translate it into like a 2-page adventure that just some randos could run in like 3 hours at a brewery and get it done. Cause there's so much that you put on the page that is just up here in your head, like essentially automatically doing the calculations for you. And it's so difficult to just put all that down in a way you can explain to somebody else how to use it. I think that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a lot of it would be like, why is pop music so boring? and it's because like pop music has to relate. It has to touch everyone. And so when you're like DMing is like a culture, like especially like if you DM the same players and especially if like you're on your second or third campaign or something, it's all shorthand. It's like it's a private culture. So you form this like subculture. So you're making like you're like in Germany in the 70s making industrial music. And
we lost you again.
If you like what you hear, consider subscribing and giving us a review over on Apple Podcasts. Especially early in the feed, subscriptions and reviews are super helpful for bringing new listeners our way. Thank you!